Welcome to the Justus Show. Today I'm joined by Scooter Wadsworth and Andrew Elster, the founders of Palmetto Privacy. Thanks for coming on the show, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Andrew, actually, I think I met you for the first time a year ago. Do you want to kind of recount that story quickly? Because I think it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, well, let's see. We were on a mutual Slack channel, and you threw out that you have to be traveling through Greenville, South Carolina. So I was like, hey, stop by. And then another friend of ours who I actually hadn't met prior to this also said stop by, and he hosted. So we went over to his house, and
it was the warmest Southern hospitality.
It was a lot of fun. Talked about all kinds of crazy things.
It was in the middle of COVID, so just visiting strangers was quite unusual at that moment. And we just were like, hey, let's mix up some cocktails at James's house, and it was really a good time. And then I just met Scooter for the first time in person, also in Greenville. Scooter, do you want to talk about this place? You took us to this amazing restaurant. It was your pick, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's a place called Saskatoon, and they specialize in sort of exotic game meats. So, like for instance, I think I had kangaroo and ostrich that day, and I don't recall what everybody else ate, but I will say I'm quite a fan of kangaroo, but ostrich I could take or leave.
There was a boar sausage, I think that was it a boar sausage?
Yeah.
It was exquisite. It was very good. It was a great restaurant, Saskatoon in Greenville. Check it out. So, yeah, we're here to talk about Palmetto Privacy. And this is your new project. You're working on it together. You were kind enough to sponsor this show without even knowing what it was going to be, getting it off the ground. That's a huge help to me, and I'm super excited about where it's going to go. What is Palmetto Privacy? What is the problem that you're trying to solve?
Okay, so in a nutshell, the problem is that for individual users on the internet, right? I mean,
right.
We're almost all aware at some level that our privacy is, let's say at the very least, it leaks away, right? And there are all these sort of touch points where things you do on the internet are actually surveilled in some way, right? And unfortunately, a lot of our devices that we use in our own homes, like our routers and all those hardware pieces that we buy and pay for, they don't necessarily respect our privacy either, right? They're kind of the first conduit into the advertising networks, right? To configure your router, they want you to install an app and go connect to their cloud application that then talks back to your router, right? That's right there in your living room. And our goal is to sort of stop that first layer of leakage and then move on and help to stop leaks all along the way. I mean, sure, there is no such thing as perfect privacy, but we're going to help you get better privacy.
And we're starting with a router.
Yes.
Is this going to be? This is the proof of concept that we're working on right now. Can you talk about sort of that layer of the privacy question? Because I think it would probably be important for, I mean, if you're a developer, you might know, but even a lot of developers don't really know about network security or even best practices, like when you're using public Wi-Fi. I'm curious, like, why is that layer a great place to start with this problem?
Sure. Our initial sort of thought was the fact that, right, like even if I'm using my own router in my own home, and even if I trust that, in order to resolve an address, or right, like I don't necessarily work in numbers, right? So the IP address that has to be linked to an address that I can recall, like youtube.com, for instance, right? It's linked to an IP address that the computer navigates to. So you have to resolve that address, youtube.com, to a numeric IP, right? And in that process, that is actually one of the earliest leakage points, right? In that basically you have to resolve that name. So we are allowing you to sort of at the router point, host all your DNS there on your router. So you're not going to say Google or any of these other services that are so kindly giving you like totally free access to the DNS. They also get a lot of data out of that, right? Like this IP goes to this point.
Yeah, personally, want to get deeper into actually exactly how the router works, and hopefully we actually will get to do that. But I want to give you time to touch on this problem because you just mentioned it a little bit with Google, other big tech companies. You probably want to talk about the ISPs. I mean, what kind of privacy concerns will normal people and developers have because of these big tech companies and the power that they have over our data?
Yeah, you want to talk about this, Andrew? We can.
Sure. Given that DNS is kind of the first point of information that companies start acquiring, if you're not in control of that, you're just letting every activity, every website that you're visiting, everything you're doing on the internet, you're just letting that be exposed all over the place.
I mean, you're basically broadcasting your location.
It
right?
is like broadcasting your location. One of the things about that's kind of interesting is the internet's become an incredible marketing tool. And the marketing is always trying to get better and better at reaching people and targeting people. And so it's kind of happened just by the way things have evolved. Companies are advertising networks are basically getting all of this information for free, just sucking in everything that you're doing, and they can use that to build a profile of you and sell that profile to advertisers. It's kind of creepy and obnoxious. They just get all this information and can just pinpoint lots of fascinating details about you just based on what you're doing online, and then really try to pinpoint and target, manipulate your purchasing.
And they're doing this data gathering via means of sort of aggregation, right? Like they've got so many sources, like every big, and I actually don't know the business sort of behind it very well at all, but my understanding is that you've basically got all these big companies that are selling to data brokers. And so they're able to like create if you know that this IP is visiting all these different sites, you can ascertain whether or not that's this given person, more or less, or a type of person who is probably this person, right? So from your router, every site you visit is able to get your IP address, which is basically your location. Am I getting this right?
Yes, more or less, yeah.
Okay, so people who are surfing the web are more or less broadcasting their location every time they refresh the page. That's like the normal user behavior.
Yep, correct.
And so by building the router, you're gonna allow them to spoof their IP and therefore their location, and you probably do it for them so they don't even have to think about it. And suddenly, from now on, all of their at-home usage is impossible to trace.
No, it's not necessarily IP spoofing per se, right? Because I mean that requires a change of the traffic, right? I mean, this is just sort of like when you do the resolution of the address to the domain, right? We are doing that sort of on device with one of the root name servers that the whole internet kind of uses, right? So that means a private company cannot sort of slurp up that data at that point.
Because there's some kind of intermediary that does not resolve back to you?
Well, I mean, it's more or less you are doing the resolution locally instead of using this other third party to do the resolution.
Right.
So that third party cannot get the access. So your contract effectively with the site you're going to is still roughly the same at this point. There are ways that you can sort of mask that, but that's kind of a next step kind of a deal.
Yeah. Okay. As you can see, I'm one of the developers who does not understand this layer of the of the equation.
One common is on your router, you've either just left up the default and it's using your ISP as its first point of resolution in a DNS. Or some people put in Google's or Cloudflare's or OpenDNS. There's a number of different service providers, but Google was pretty popular because they advertised, hey, just put one that you'll have fast domain name resolution.
Is Google behind 1.1.1.1?
No,
That's
that's
right.
actually that's actually Cloudflare. 8.8.8.8 is Google.
8. Okay. Still
8,
like
8.8.8, and then their secondary was 4.1.4.
okay. So my guess is that you guys, as people who are in the know, don't use any of these.
I try not to. I mean, if I can avoid it, but I mean, like at home, I do all of my locally cached stuff. But I mean, you sometimes have to use actually third parties, or if I'm on a public, I'm not even as careful as I should be, quite frankly, right? I mean,
Yeah, well,
I am leaking data all over the place because, I mean, well, like a big part of that is actually personal OPSEC, if you will, right? I'm not as careful as I should be. And that's part of what brought me back to this whole thing is like 17-year-old me would really be angry at 39-year-old me. Let's put it that way. Because I'm not living up to any of the ideals I held when I was that age. And I let life happen. And so one of our goals with this is to make it so you can still live your life and let your life happen and not have to worry as much, right? It's one less thing to worry about.
You mentioned OPSEC, which I think you mean like personal OPSEC, personal operational security. Is that what you mean by that? Mm-hmm. Could you kind of dive into that a little bit? Because that seems like a fascinating notion and something that maybe if it pervaded the culture a little bit more, we would have a more interesting society full of smarter people. So can you talk about what does that mean, like personal operational security?
Sure. And I mean, I don't necessarily like using that term for it often because it sounds so like shadowy, like
sounds
operator,
cool.
like a Delta op. Right. I mean, and so I mean, it sounds actually super shadowy and super everything. Yeah. It's just kind of a term that more or less means kind of like the things you do on a daily basis to kind of actually make sure that like the things you do and don't do, I guess, that kind of help to keep things either more private or more secure, right? It's kind of like it can either mask your identity or put out your identity or what. I mean, it's not this, and I mean, it sounds like this whole like a cloak and daggery thing. And I mean, and with some people it probably is and feels that way. Yeah, with others, it's just I want to try to not share as much, right? And so it's basically just it's kind of making a conscious, more sort of mindful kind of a decision about what you do and don't share. Kind of in a nutshell. And that is at odds with a lot of these larger companies, right? Who their goal is to get you to share as much and as often as you can and will, right? And so it's easy to fall into the trap of sort of your OPSEC standard baseline, if you will, is not private at all, right? I mean, effectively, you're shouting on your front porch instead of like just talking quietly in your home, right?
This might be my problem, shouting from my digital front porch. I want to ask you both kind of what you think some of the most valuable or minimal effective security practices for. I kind of want to talk specifically to developers because I feel like developers there's a broad enough range there where you have people who are kind of just getting into the industry who don't really know much, and there's maybe especially if you came up in like boot camps and you don't know like web fundamentals, you wouldn't even be thinking very clearly about some of this layer of the privacy concerns. So kind of addressing that audience, what are some of the basic things that you should do to get ahead privately?
Well, host your own DNS.
Yeah.
We'll start there. You should also pay attention to the browser that you're using, as well as the extensions that you have installed. So there's so many different layers to this privacy onion. So start first by resolving your own domain resolution. Then as you start looking at, okay, what are the tools that you're using to access web pages, you got to start thinking about those kinds of things. So advertisers are looking to fingerprint your browser. So you want your browser to be as generic and unidentifiable as possible, which means if you have a whole bunch of different extensions enabled, not everybody has those same extensions enabled, and so your browser is now more unique.
It's a fingerprint.
Yeah, it's fingerprint. You want to pay attention to your cookie settings and things like that. So, again, these advertising networks, they've got these third-party cookies they're planning, and they're trying to track your your patterns across the internet. Facebook in particular does this. So everybody's got a like button, and people are putting Facebook marketing pixels on their websites and elsewhere, and so Facebook knows about what you're doing. There are other ad networks that do the same thing. So you kind of have to pay attention to that, and you can block third-party tracking cookies sometimes in the settings of your browser. You can use a browser like Brave to kind of help with that. It has some defaults that will try and block trackers and add stuff. Don't load images in your email. So
don't load images in your emails.
Right, because these trackers are in the emails. Basically all you're doing is you're what's called a pixel, which is just an image tag that just one by one. It's invisible. It's not going to show up or anything. And all it is so that your browser, when it loads the page, is going to make a network request out to the server, and that's all that's for. And there may be query parameters attached to that to signal things. But anyway, that's how people know. Oh, you've read the email. That's how they're tracking that. Oh, if you've clicked certain things in the email, if you're interactive, it's all based on these trackers and stuff. So it's like turn off images so that they don't get that information.
Wow. And so what browser should I be using every day as my go-to browser?
I use Brave as my go-to. It's based on Chromium. And
do we trust Chromium?
What?
Do we trust Chromium?
Well, that's a good question. So Chromium is kind of it's the browser before Google turns it into Chrome and does their thing with it. So it's open source. People have looked into it, dug into it. So I don't know.
Like a lot of privacy, though, it's like there is no, you will never have, like, as I said, perfect privacy, right? I mean, what you're looking for is pragmatic privacy, right? I mean, you still want to do things on the web.
Yes.
And you still want to view some images, right? And so, but you just have to be more mindful of the trade-offs you're making, right? And there are things like actually Brave, which, I mean, ostensibly Brave seems okay, right? But at the end of the day, it is kind of an advertising company, right? That happens to sell a browser, right? I mean, they can give away the browser, but I mean, they do serve up ads that are, in theory, not really tied to you. But I mean, we don't.
Brave is serving up ads?
Yeah, Brave has an ad service. They're trying to create a privacy conscious ad network.
Okay.
Yeah, and I like it in theory, right? But it's the kind of thing that, right? I mean, I don't know what I don't know, and I don't have time to look into everything at all times. And so it's the kind of thing where, I mean, I personally use Brave for the most part, and some actually Firefox with some things that I've customized and whatnot. But but in general, but when I hear advertisements, right, even privacy respecting, right, it makes me a little bit leery, right? I'm a bit like, okay, what's actually going on here? And they've not given me any reason to actively distrust, but they've not necessarily given me reason to actively trust either, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But which actually brings up the question, right? Like, you were talking from a developer's point of view. Like, I mean, what are some things we can do, right? And it's that whole actually golden rule thing, right? To do unto others as you would have done unto you, right? The whole concept of, I mean, we are developing applications as developers that in theory people are using, like hopefully on a daily basis and hopefully often, right? So I mean, we need to really sort of think about what is the data that we are collecting and why we are collecting it, and be upfront about it. But also like treat data more like it's toxic than actually worth
then it's gold, right?
Yeah.
So this actually kind of brings me to a point that we wanted to touch on, which was sort of some of the cultural issues in the technology community around privacy. I think one of the words that we used was that a lot of technologists and developers have been black-pilled on technology. What does that mean? and justify it. And actually, let me just preface it by saying I agree completely. So, but I'll allow you to explain.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency to be overly optimistic about the future. The future is golden, it's rosy, it's bright. Technology is going to solve everything. The internet's going to be, it's just going to deliver unprecedented knowledge and learning. And what we're kind of realizing is, well, technology might be neutral, people are not, and we take our human failings with us into the future as well. So we're now sort of realizing that more and more just everyday people are kind of realizing that there's just unprecedented levels of power concentrated in large technology companies, and all the devices that we're using and the services that we're engaged with don't necessarily have our best interests in mind. And I think a lot of people who, like Mike Skinner talks about, his 13-year-old self hacking away on Linux, and he had an idea of what the internet was going to be like. Now it's like it's real easy to be disillusioned when you look and see how what large companies have done with technology and how they've misused it. It's real easy, I think, to get disillusioned in general and be like, tech, it's all bad. Yeah,
well, the big companies misused it. I mean, the government, I think, what was it? Prism, Snowden's leak. I mean, that all happened, and there was no reaction kind of at the societal level that would have pushed back against it. And I think what you're describing, Andrew, is more like in technology. I mean, it's funny because on one hand, you're talking about us, we're too optimistic about where technology will go. And I think that's true. But on the other hand, there's a lot of like, what's the word? Like nihilism in technology with developers who kind of think that we, like most of developers I know, don't think we should have electronic voting systems, right? Like they don't trust developers to build that kind of technology.
No. Right.
And this is what you mean, Scooter, when you're talking about black pills. The black pill is, it's all pointless. Like there's no hope. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, like actually some people take the black pill and like it has a reaction of, it doesn't matter. I'll never have privacy anyway. Like here's all my data, right? It's open. Well, like others are like, nope. And they turn off the radios and everything. They don't take their cell phone anywhere. They don't but at the same time, you're trading the utility of these devices because of like, I don't want to call it fear, but just this sort of like, you are indexing on the privacy aspects and trying to preserve what privacy you still have over the utility of these things, right? Like, I mean, in general, like, I mean, I will try to leave my phone like at home or in the car, or like, I mean, I don't want it on my person all the time. And, and I mean, I've given up on this. Well, like at first I thought it was kind of cool. Like, oh, I can use the cloud as my dev environment. And no matter what kind of a device I'm on, I can just have my environment. And I'm like, you know what? No.
Well, go into that, because I've actually started moving in this direction towards like doing all my development on the cloud. Why not?
Well, I mean, it just gives more touch points, right? And I'm trying to eliminate some of those touch points. And
you mean just with the internet more broadly, like you just want to be kind of offline? Okay.
Right. I mean, it's like, because a big part of like protecting the whole concept of actually privacy, like I held this view that was kind of based in sort of the 90s view of what the net could be. And it was kind of this kind of like a distributed thing where everybody sort of had their little like corner of the web, right? And not only the web, right, of the internet, right? And they could sort of choose when to be online and offline, but you more or less lived your life in the place in which you actually inhabited physically, right? Then we sort of entered this sort of concept where like placelessness almost became the goal, right?
You mean as far as like human living conditions, like we all want to work remotely and
right, it's
be
all
global citizens or whatever?
Right, we want to work remotely. We want to sort of, a lot of our socialization takes place on and through screens, right? A lot of these things. And so that was one of the things that really interested me, because actually my training is in geography. I'm a geographer by training, right? I am not a computer scientist. So don't ask me the hard questions. I could never get a job at Google if I wanted to, right? I couldn't pass the whiteboard tests. But the whole thing is, right, and so I became absolutely fascinated in the whole COVID period, like how there was this rise of interest in like local experiences, right? Because you weren't seeing all the pictures all the time of everybody like traveling to all these really cool looking locales, right? And so you started kind of going, you know what, I'm tired of studying the geography of this wall of my house. I'd like to go out. And so as you became more comfortable, you went further and further right into your own space. And you found kind of these interesting things about your own local spaces as people started moving from the cities that might have had more restrictive rules, or they found that like they all of a sudden, because of the lockdowns, they weren't getting the benefits of the city. So why pay the money, and they could work remotely, so they weren't necessarily as tied to the city anymore. And so, I mean, in a way, it's been kind of interesting how that whole concept of placelessness and how we work has kind of shifted to a heavier indexing on the mindfulness of place in which we exist. And I'm kind of seeing a trend where actually people are sort of conversing more locally, right? They're talking to people more actually physically. Not that we ever truly stopped, but I mean, if you think about it, right? I mean, you would order your groceries, you would order your like Uber Eats or your DoorDash, and you barely have interactions with a person, right? It was all kind of a machine. And that's kind of been an interesting thing, but it also means that there's all these sort of data touch points wherein it took a few times of me ordering the number 5 special at a restaurant for that server. I kind of go, hey, you're that guy who always orders the number 5, right?
Right. This is the guy's thing. Right.
Right. But a machine sees you do it twice. Right. And they're like, okay, I'm starting to pull a pattern here. I'm going to keep watching this.
Right.
And so, sure, the same things are happening, but it's at a more accelerated scale. So, I mean, sure, I am giving up that privacy by ordering at the restaurant too, but I'm also creating human connection, right? And I'm more mindful of those things, right? Like, I mean, that this is almost a conversation between me and that server, right? Whom I always want to eat at their table because I really like them or whatever, right? And sure, I'm probably going off on a heavy tangent here.
Well, I think this does kind of tie into like one of our. So we had started talking about the routers, like what you're doing at home, what kind of like the big leak or the privacy leak is, and we. I think the other question that I think would be on a lot of people's minds is like, yeah, well, I'm traveling. Just got back from 2 weeks traveling. I'm going away again for 2 weeks in a couple weeks. So I'm traveling constantly. It's my phone that's the big leak, right? What, I'm on iPhone because I think that it's more secure and more private than Android. Am I right about that? What's the next step for me? I mean, I can't air gap my iPhone, right?
Right. We all have iPhones, right? What's interesting is theoretically it's better in the sense that you're Apple's customer. not the product, whereas Google is the advertising company and you are the product. They're trying to get your eyeballs in front of advertisers. So theoretically, the privacy experience is better on the iPhone. And there have been in the news recently with some high profile disputes with Google and Facebook about privacy practices and stuff. But your data still leaks from the phone.
Right.
Apple's not necessarily trusted party. They're more like is the enemy of my enemy my friend kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really good way of putting it.
And a lot of this, they're not necessarily. I don't know if they're truly concerned with improving privacy, or this is a convenient way of muscling out competition on their platform.
But at some level, they want to sell me another iPhone next year, and that's more what they're trying to actually sell me. And the services are almost a part of making my iPhone experience a little better. So they can sort of afford to give you a little more privacy because that's a part of what they're selling you in theory. But again, it's like a lot of things, right? I mean, there are so many ways that like you can pierce that veil too. I mean, even if Apple says like, here, I've created you this perfect box, and it's not a perfect box, but it's a better box, right?
Yeah.
You can make choices that can definitely sort of say like, ooh, my box is wide open and I cut a window here. And
well, and my assumption is that Palmetto Privacy, building routers, eventually getting to something like a cell phone, like this type of competitive pressure where you're saying, hey, we can do even better than the world's biggest company at this question. That will force them to kind of double down on it, right? Like I feel like it's a win-win. Like even if either they double down on privacy and you suddenly get a more private world, or they don't care and you get that market share. And so it's like you win-win no matter what by pursuing this avenue. And I think again, like I keep returning to this culture thing, because I think in tech, you do kind of you get both sides. I think what Andrew was describing is like irrational optimism, especially in startups where they're like, oh, I'm working on the next Snapchat. We're changing the world, and it's like, I don't know about that guy.
Sure.
But then there's also this sort of nihilism that's also common in technology, which is like, oh, like every big major company is evil and wicked and just trying to steal your like data and like take advantage of you. And to some extent that's true. Like I certainly don't think of Apple as like they're just slightly less morally awful than every other tech company.
Yeah,
right?
They're almost inert, right? It's not one direction or the other.
Well, enemy of my enemy is what Andrew said. It's the perfect way of putting it. But I think what you're doing is you're kind of applying pressure. But the cultural question is, how do you make it? It's got to be cool. It's just got to be cool. Like it's got to be Apple in the 1984 commercial, I think is what Scooter like had brought up, that except even more radical. And that's what we're seeing. When we're talking about local, the sort of re-emergence of local, the revival of local, what I've seen, at least where I'm from, which is like a red county in blue Maryland, has been this just local politics, like resurgence, like all these, I mean, there's a Board of Ed protest tonight that I'm going to. I don't even have any kids. I don't care. I mean, I do care about the education system, but like, I don't have like a vested interest. I just want to show up because the protests have become fun. It's become cool to go to stuff like this and just slam your socialist superintendent. Like, why not? Which I think is just playing into what you're talking about with the local revival. But like when all those people are like, hey, we're going to buy the Palmetto Privacy router because we need to have a robust communication network on our like libertarian advocacy group. The next step is obviously the phone, right? And Apple is going to be, I think, I mean, just you see what the direction they're going with the culture and banning things from their stores. Parler got kicked off of the iPhone store. I mean, you can't. That's not freedom of speech, right? So, okay, we've talked about routers, we talked about phones. There's we touched on extensions and stuff like that, cloud solutions. We need to extricate ourselves from all these big tech companies that are stealing our data. Where do we start? What's the biggest offender?
That's an interesting question. I mean, honestly, the biggest offender is, unfortunately, it's ourselves, right? We choose to use a lot of these like services, right? In that like, oh, I have to be on Facebook. I have to be on Instagram. have to be on Snapchat or TikTok or any number of these things, right? Because that's how I do my sales, right? And it's kind of interesting. You were talking about that whole thing about how like Apple, and you sort of alluded to how like Apple is more or less like selling you a lifestyle that just happens to be through the conduit of a phone, right? And in theory, that's kind of what we're hoping to eventually get to as well, right? It's arguably a different kind of a lifestyle, maybe one where the fashions are a little more like tinfoil than like shiny aluminum, right? But I mean, it's a lifestyle.
Tinfoil is so hot right now,
right? I'm telling you, yeah, it's going to be huge.
Dude, if anyone has had like, okay, the biggest sort of reputation turnaround in the last year has got to be Alex Jones. Like, I feel like now when people criticize Alex Jones, like I look at them like they're crazy. I'm like, dude, this man was basically right about everything if you actually listen to what he said. And I'm over, and I don't even follow him, but like the things that they accuse him of being the worst about turned out to be the most correct.
Sure.
And so anyway, so tinfoil is in. That's what you were going for.
Yeah, and I mean the concept, right, is like, yeah, and it's a different kind of a person, right? And but that whole concept of it's important that we sort of sell a lifestyle, if you will, right? Because as we mentioned earlier, bringing it back to that whole personal OPSEC thing, right? A part of that is effectively your lifestyle dictates a lot of that, right? And the things you choose to sort of mindfully do and even not mindfully do, right? If like a part of this is I mean, I hate to co-opt the term mindfulness because I mean has a very different kind of a connotation, and like I respect that, right? In that, but it is a mindful sort of practice in that you are choosing what to engage with, how to engage with it, right? I mean, and you are making conscious choices and sort of instead of sort of allowing others to sort of like dictate how you do things, you are putting your foot down and saying, you know what, I'm willing to play here, but I'm going to do it in this way. That is a very different conversation than, well, I guess I got to be on this thing because everybody else is, right? It's there is the FOMO issue, right? And a big part of that is now, I'll admit it's probably easier because I am now in that classification that I guess I'm a geriatric millennial. And so I can sort of almost choose to identify as an Xer or whatever because I'm right there on that line. Yeah. And so I probably view things very differently because I didn't really have a cell phone in my hand until I was 18, right? Yeah. And so and even then it didn't have a camera. Sure, I could text, but it was a real pain because I only had the 0 through 9 keys and everything. So it was not as exciting. It was novel, but it wasn't this like all-encompassing thing. It was this thing that was in your pocket and you pulled it out when you had to actually send a quick message or something, right? It wasn't this part of your life yet.
Yeah.
And so I knew life before that period. And so I will admit that there are sort of parts of sort of psychology and things that I don't necessarily understand of some of the younger folks, right? But my hope is that we can sort of present them with alternatives, right? Like say, like instead of maybe hosting your group on Facebook, maybe we should get you on something like a Matrix server or something, right? Where sort of you can still have those group chats and controls, and we can sort of help you with that, right? And it should give you an experience like on a de-Googled Android phone where we can still get you on those sort of deals. And just to be completely forthright, we are looking at options to make sort of a pry phone, if you will. I'm sure we can't call it that because I really don't want to be sued. But I mean, but we have this option to, we are looking at like phone manufacturers and having sort of early conversations with, I mean, what are our order minimums at this point? I mean, because I mean, arguably that's a tough market to enter. But so we're starting with like the router and sort of we're starting at home, and then like as you go further and further out, hopefully sort of actually adding a safety tether that lets you be more safe as you get further and further away from your trusted home base. And a part of that is the phones and that whole kind of a lifestyle and kind of, but making it easier to make those choices, right? In that there is a provider who provides you with services whom you've built a relationship of trust with. And we can't break that trust, which also is going to, in theory, we know that's going to give us a cap as to our maximum kind of the valuations, if you will, and all those kinds of things. I mean, we know that we can't really become a unicorn because effectively, well, sure, I mean, we could become a unicorn, but that unicorn would have to have a poison pill at the ready, right? Because if we were to be, say, purchased by the wrong company, we cease to adhere to that contract effectively we have created with our users and customers. So we effectively have to be ready at any moment to actually pull our own plug, because we are not like living up to the expectations that we have set with our customers, and we are breaking that trust. We have to sort of find a way to maintain that trust. And so, I mean, we are making conscious choices now that hopefully will serve us well in the future. But I mean, it's
so I want to kind of return back, circle the conversation all the way around, as Saki would say, circle back to, I mean, the router is the question, which I think I want to know when I'm going to get my hands on one. So think about that, what you're going to say there. But I do want to just address this topic here where you're talking about sort of the phone having become this identity part, or a part of our identity. Like, we take the phone everywhere, like we carry it with us everywhere. It's the first thing I see when I wake up in the morning. I definitely am part of that sort of the younger millennial side of things. So I've been addicted to my phone for like 10 years now. And would
get off my lawn.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating thing because, like, I'm a Christian. I am very skeptical of the transhumanist thing that is taking over the world right now, and I kind of rebel against it inherently. But at the same time, I don't have any problem with someone getting braces. Why should I really have a problem with someone having kind of like a phone or a piece of technology as like an extended part of their identity? Which is why I actually think what Palmetto Privacy might be able to do, as far as allowing me to sort of transcend the biological boundaries of my human condition, in a way that's in keeping with my basic Christian principles, that like I have individual sovereignty. Like, I deserve to be able to control my own technology, to be able to surf the web without being spied on by all these giant corporations. So I feel like you are allowing people to continue to participate in this sort of massive meta biological experiment that we're having without selling their soul for it, which is exciting. Router. When am I going to get one in my closet right here? When am I going to get to replace that old Verizon box?
We should hopefully be in beta with them by the end of the year.
Okay.
We have a hardware manufacturer here in the United States that we are working with. And we have the dev kits in hand, and we are actively developing it. And we are using Elixir and Nerves to kind of actually play with that. Hint for all you Elixir folks, that's actually pretty exciting.
To the Elixir folks who are like listening to the podcast with like blinders on their computer screen so that none of their colleagues see that they are a dissident. I mean, this is the question, right? When are all the political dissidents going to come out to play? And
all 5 of you who are listening now, like, that's yeah.
I don't know. We've got a little bit of a contingent going, Scooter. I hope if my enemies are listening to this, that they are like aware they're surrounded on all sides by good people. Okay. Like, on all sides, you've got good people hiding out. You just don't even know who they are.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? Like I recall that there was a poem. I'm sorry, I can't recall like who it's by, but that first they came for the communists, and I said nothing because I was not a communist, right? Yeah. It's almost like we're kind of in that mode in a different way, right? Sure, the script is kind of flipped around a little bit, but I mean, it's like unfortunately, it's like we all
communists who are coming for everybody else.
Well, I wasn't going to go there necessarily, but like it's kind of this whole concept of, right? Like, I mean, Scooter,
you have 2 "Do Not Tread on Me" flags in your shot right now. You are not. Yeah, oh. Isn't that one like are you using one as a tablecloth back there?
Oh yeah.
That's like, dude, your libertarian bona fides are clear. Like no one thinks you're on the same side as the communists.
No,
you're not fooling anyone.
No, I mean it's more, but I mean I also make no never minds, right? That I mean, arguably the structures of power, if you will, right? They don't necessarily have a particular side other than what's expedient for them, right? And so if those winds shift and all of a sudden you're no longer useful, you are a liability, and that's when you're lined up against the wall, right? And yeah, I don't mean to make it sound actually super violent, but we all actually have a common interest in basically like we are not actually part of the big tech wheel. Even if we work for some of these big tech companies, right? Yeah. We are not really necessarily a part of those sort of inner circles that make the real decisions and so I mean we have to sort of think that at some point, if they have all this power, they're using it for something I like, at what point is it going to be used for something that I don't like, right? At what point is it going to be turned on me and those like me, right? Yeah. And that's a very scary and very real thing. And so, I mean, a part of it is, right, I mean, if we sort of choose when to connect and when to like disconnect and what kind of signal we are putting up in the noise and what kind of noise we're putting up to sort of mask the signal, right? These are all sort of important things that we all have to think about in our own way, and hopefully like at companies like ours. And I mean, we're not the only ones who are doing this kind of thing, right? I think we have some unique things that as we get more out there, I think we have some unique views on things, or we're going to do some things in unique ways. But I mean, there are a lot of people who are working on these problems, and I think these problems are going to be solved by a number of other people. Like, I'm glad I have Andrew here, who is much smarter and more talented than I am, like who can actually make these things a reality. Because, well, I think it's evident at this point I talk a lot, but I mean, he's the real doer. Right. So I hope I'm not going to back him into a corner, but hopefully, by the end of this year, we will see you will be able to.
This is like Steve Jobs apologizing to Wozniak for like setting some super ambitious deadline. Like,
yeah. So by Christmas time,
you have nothing to apologize for, Jobs.
You should have a router in your closet, in the beta form, right? These are not going to be the perfect, like go to market form.
Send me the alpha. You can send me the alpha. I will be testing. I'll be giving you feedback, brutal feedback, design feedback. I will be critiquing the soldering of your wires.
You got it. You're already on the list. And if you would also like to get on the list, we have been sort of in the lab, if you will, right? Yeah. And and I have fallen down on actually my part in that I have been lax on creating our sort of our site or our portal where you can sort of actually get more info. We are actively working on that part now. So hopefully by the time you hear this podcast, you will be able to actually sign up and actually get more info. And
you can also email any of us.
Yep.
You can email any of us. Scooter at palmettoprivacy.com, Andrew at palmettoprivacy.com, or Justus at palmettoprivacy.com. I got my own email address because I need to get off of Gmail. I need to get off of Google everything. My goal is to get, like, I want to get off Chrome, what you're talking about with the extensions. I'm the biggest offender. Like, I am the chief of privacy sinners. I've got terrible, like an obvious, like I'm the only person in the world using Grammarly and the Vimium plugin and LastPass. It's like, they know me. I actually never get searched going through airports because they just like I reek of patriotic responsibility, and they just know that I'm harmless because I'm so transparent about everything. But no, one day they're gonna come to get me. So I'm gonna have to get serious about my privacy. Any other final plugs, asks to the audience? Email Scooter at palmettoprivacy.com, Andrew at palmettoprivacy.com to get on some beta lists, alpha lists, etc. If you care about your privacy, if you care about robust communication networks, get involved. Anything else, guys, before we sign this one off?
I would also just throw out, privacy is a lifestyle. It's also a happier lifestyle because ultimately to achieve greater privacy, you need to simplify what what you're doing, you got to pare things down, and the end result of that is less dependence on your digital tools, increased real human interaction,
Yep.
less screen based life. You can break free of this Pavlovian experiment where their device is trying to drive your impulses and your purchasing and your everything else. Break free from that. Start unplugging. Start simplifying. Be less dependent on digital things, and not only will you not be leaking as much data, but you'll be much happier for it.
Amen, brother. Scooter, anything to add?
Unplug and go get on a bike or something.
Yes. All right. That's it for this episode of the Justus Eapen Show. Thank you again to our guests, Scooter Wadsworth and Andrew Elster, the founders of Palmetto Privacy. Once again, I am Justus Eapen. Don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you are listening. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit the bell. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. I'm Justus Eapen everywhere. That's just use a pen everywhere. And join me again next week on the Justus Eapen Show. Although I think we're going to do this show like 2 or 3 times a week. So join me next time.